Like so many fantasy authors who have gone before me, I am fascinated and inspired by the world building of J.R.R. Tolkien. And recently I was reading The Art of the Lord of the Rings, and about halfway through this book, I was struck by the fact that it's pretty much all maps and terrain. That Tolkien did not really draw his people, fair enough. People can be very hard to draw, but he also didn't draw clothing styles or a detailed interior of a hobbit house or jewelry or emblems or weapons or furniture, foods. There's very little of that. It's pretty much all maps and terrain, and to a tiny extent architecture, but mostly in the context of architecture being an extension of the terrain. And I'm not hating on this. It was very, very fascinating to me to just see how much work he put into thinking out these maps and thinking out the logistics of the journeys of his characters and how the terrain was like really going to work and how it would work with his prose, which has such an element of this majestic, sweeping travel, these places that even if you've never seen the movies, you have such an idea in your mind's eye of these places of Middle Earth. But it's a lot of maps, which got me thinking how maps are almost synonymous with fantasy world building. Maps are usually regarded as like the starting point, the core of fantasy world building. And then I thought, am I making this up, or this is right? Like, it is all really about maps. So I looked up world building online. Like, I looked at the world building Reddit. I looked up world building on YouTube just to see like what comes up the most. And I would say that yes, I'm not crazy. Maps and terrain are probably the biggest thing that comes up as topics. This isn't to say that people don't talk about other stuff, but maps and terrain are huge. And it is one of my goals in the year to come to do a proper map of my fantasy world, one that is shareable and not just for my own reference. But I've gone this far. I've published 7 books about this world, and I have not included a map in any of them. And I've had map guilt for some years. I have the sense that I'm not really a real fantasy writer until I've completed a map. So it was in the course of reading this book that I was like, yeah, this is where my map guilt comes from, because Tolkien was all about the maps. And in fact, I've heard a couple people kind of even mention fantasy as like it's the genre with the map in the front. Like, you know, you're gonna sink into a fantasy world when you open it up and there's the map. But usually when I open a fantasy book, I open it and I look at the map and I'm like, that's a pretty map. Or occasionally maybe that's a stupid map. And then I move on and I read the book, and I probably only ever look at the map again, like 10% of the time. Maybe everybody else is loving the map, looking at the map all the time. Maybe you're all desperately consulting the map constantly. But I'm going to guess I'm not completely alone in not really caring about the map once I get into the book. Like, even in real life, I barely know where the heck I'm going. So that got me thinking, like, is this map thing necessary to fantasy books, actually? Like, or is this all just because Tolkien dug cartography that we all now feel like our books have to be based around maps? And I started to think how much Tolkien's particular interests as a writer kind of defined what the fantasy genre was going forward. That he was very interested in maps and terrain, which makes sense based on the kind of fantasy that he was writing. There's a journey. It was clearly very important to him that this journey was realistically rendered, and the distances and the time things took made sense, especially when he's got the party splitting up and rejoining. He wanted to make sure that that made sense. And of course, he also was involved in a world war. When is the other time in life where you would really want a map besides a journey? It would be like a battlefield. Terrain maps. And of course, Tolkien was very interested in language. Not every fantasy author bothers to come up with a conlang, but I did see that there are a lot of videos and discussion on like how to have good character names, good place names, how to at least make it seem like you thought about it as much as Tolkien did, even if you don't want to put that level of work into it. And then, of course, Tolkien also put a lot of time into like the more myth, legend, history of the world, but in a very kind of lofty, legendary way. Not in as much the George R. R. Martin kind of way, where it was more history book history, but more of this very mythic kind of history. And throughout my entire life, as someone who loves fantasy, I've often felt a little like a weirdo among fantasy fans because so many of my fellow fantasy fans think in similar terms, that they think about establishing like myth and legend, map, names, place names, that those are kind of like the defining features of fantasy. Fantasy races and cultures often still follow the Tolkien template. And of course, Dungeons and Dragons drew so much from Tolkien, and Dungeons and Dragons games logically need maps, but they also need systems. So I think Dungeons and Dragons brought more like magic systems with particular rules and spells and things like that. Tolkien's actual world did not really have like the D&D kind of magic system, but we do think of magic systems also as being a very important part of fantasy in general. And of course, there are a lot of fantasy worlds that don't focus on those things, especially as many decades have gone by and we've had many decades of different trends and different authors influencing and shaping what fantasy looks like. We are no longer stuck in this Tolkien model entirely. And yet it does kind of remain the default, and even more so perhaps when we talk about world building. I think it's often still from the perspective of what Tolkien found important is still what's the most important and is what defines world building. And when you're talking about fantasy authors who really are like hardcore world builders, a lot of times you're still talking about Tolkien first, and then you might talk about some other influences. George R. R. Martin had more of a historical influence. Brandon Sanderson's books have more magic system stuff. So anyway, I've always had kind of some lifelong low-key guilt and alienation because in my fantasy world, I have not really focused on like the myth and legend. And I also don't have good maps. I have this one map. I've only drawn like 2 maps in 30 years. Clearly maps are not my priority. I'm just fumbling around. I draw a new map like every 10 years, so I've been working on this world for 30 years, and I've changed the map like twice from the initial map. So we have like the first stupid map, the second slightly better map, and the modern map that I probably did like 5 years ago. They're all not great at all. And then I have a couple of like town maps that are also very half-baked. Maps are not my forte. Terrain, distance, this stuff is not something I think about very often. I do have a conlang, so Tolkien and I were with each other on that. It's not as involved as his, of course, but I have been working on that for a while, and I do like to have consistency with my names, with the language. But I didn't read Lord of the Rings until about 10 years after I started working on my fantasy world. And the biggest inspiration for world building in particular, I had a lot of inspirations, but as far as like where I got the idea to really deep dive into a world and stick with it and keep making it richer and make it feel like a real place. Coco, you're good. You're good, babe. Sorry if there's a lot of cat noise in the background. And keep making it richer and feeling like a real place. The original inspiration for me was the ElfQuest comics. If you've been watching this channel for a while, this will not surprise you at all, but above all, the ElfQuest comics were the work that inspired me to get really invested in one fantasy world and develop it out in a big way. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking, you know what ElfQuest does not have are focus on maps. I think it was a very long time before an ElfQuest comic had a map included, like over a decade. Language, There's not like bits of language in ElfQuest. The like myth and legend, there's none of that. Magic system, it's pretty simple. The elves have like telepathic communication, and some of them have an additional telepathic or telekinetic ability, and that's about it. And there's a couple other little things that are like magical, but for the most part, that's the whole magic system right there. So all the things that we think of a lot of times when we think of world building are not concerns of ElfQuest. And yet this is some of my favorite world building ever, and was a huge influence on how I approach world building. So this is not to disparage anyone who wants to approach the world building from the perspective of, I want to start with a map and language, or at least the illusion of language. Myths, legends, magic. Capelia, come here, troublemaker. Show everyone your cute little face. Oh no, I got stuff to do. What was I saying? You know, the things that classic epic fantasy often concerns itself with. This, I would say, is more of an anthropological, cultural, social sciences, perhaps, approach to world building. When I think of the world building of ElfQuest, what is it most concerned with? The things I think of are like the kind of folkways, the spiritual codes, the culture of the elves. The main characters of ElfQuest are the Wolf Rider tribe. The premise of ElfQuest is that these elves came to this planet populated by humans like thousands of years ago, and unlike the human population, they are very long-lived, or actually generally immortal unless killed, and they have these telepathic abilities. But the Wolf Rider tribe was one particular band of elves who ended up having a wolf ancestor. Some of the elves could shapeshift, and one elf shapeshifted into a wolf, mated with a wolf, and had a half-wolf child whose blood infiltrated the Wolf Rider tribe, so they all have wolf blood, which made them mortal and a little different from all the other elves on the planet, which they're not in contact with as the story begins. They're not aware of the other elves. The elves are a very small tribal band, close-knit, with very specific kind of ways of living and thinking that are in part based on this animal blood, such as the Way, which is a kind of particular way of thinking unique to the Wolf Rider tribe, of living in the moment and accepting death and mortality. As the story progresses, the Wolf Rider tribe is driven from their original home in the forest and are forced to cross a desert to escape, where they run into another tribe of elves they have not had contact with before. These elves don't have wolf blood, they are immortal, and they live in the desert in a life that feels a little more stable, a little more pastoral, but in this somewhat of a desert climate. Their culture is a little different from the Wolf Riders, and then as the story progresses through 20 volumes of the original comic, they run into two other groups of elves. Each group of elves has their own ways of being and thinking, and this continually challenges the worldview of the Wolf Riders, particularly the main character, Cutter. However, you get to know every member of the Wolf tribe. They are all very distinct and memorable characters, and throughout the entire series, which gets extremely long over decades of comics, you see all these Wolf Riders evolve. Some of them die, some of them are challenged in painful ways, some of them make terrible choices. Their views of the world and of themselves, their spiritual beliefs, which isn't so much a religion, but is still kind of a spiritual way. The way that all those things are challenged and evolving is really the core of the world building in ElfQuest. And so my world building followed very similar lines. I was most interested in developing the cultures of a world, and it ended up being that if a character comes from a particular city or a particular cultural background, that really informs who they are. Like, I can't imagine Alfred being anything other than someone native to Atlantis and from a well-to-do family of Darmons. Likewise, I can't imagine Una or Dor being anything other than a Vendiri. I can't imagine Growl being from anywhere but the Eastern Marshes. And I can't imagine Livonia having grown up anywhere but in a northern Miralem town. Every character is such a product of their background, the place they came from, and the cultural background of their parents and their family and their class, their race. All those things really play into who they become, as well as, of course, they're all different within those, basic rules. But that was always what I found most fun about world building, was the cultural part. So it was no wonder that ElfQuest was something that I really glommed onto and was inspired by. And after the cultural piece, I would say another thing that ElfQuest does very strongly is fashion and design. The design work of ElfQuest is very impressive. Each individual tribe of elves has a very distinct style and a way of dressing, and every character that we get to know has their own kind of fashion sense that also reflects where they came from, and that goes down to what kind of materials different tribes wear, as well as the style of their clothing, emblems, colors. And we also see that reflected in like the beautiful backgrounds of different places. And of course, it is a comic book, so you really get, a true sense of the visual design of ElfQuest in a way that a book doesn't necessarily convey. But books can still be extremely visual. Like I said, you really can see Middle-earth and all of the places within it. Even if you're not imagining them quite like Tolkien intended, you're getting an overall impression that probably when you saw the movies, you might have been like, oh yeah, that's it. Or not, that have inspired subsequent visual artists over the years and kind of given it a unified look that just feels right. It feels like the book. And when artists do it, it feels right. So I think that it being a written medium instead of a visual one is no excuse for not developing out visual elements. And then perhaps the third thing that ElfQuest focuses on, in my opinion, and kind of lower down the tier, is the origin of the elves, which slowly unfolds over the course of the comics. We learn more and more about their origins and the planet they originally came from, the people that they originated from. It's not really the mythic kind of history that Tolkien got into, and it's also not this detailed kind of like real world European influenced history that George R. R. Martin has. It's more of just the way the elves are shaped by knowing their origin and learning their origin, and how they grapple with knowing where they came from and whether or not they yearn to be more like these ancestors or whether they want to stay rooted on this new planet that they have settled on. So even the way that is approached is very much a very kind of personal and cultural journey for the main characters. So I feel like this kind of world building, this cultural world building, is every bit as fascinating and rich and worthy of exploration in great depth as the more Tolkien-esque type of world building. And there certainly are other authors, world builders, role-playing game enthusiasts and designers that do enjoy that part of it just as much as I do. It's not like this is unheard of. I just thought, as I'm thinking about it, like, it's curious that we still kind of default to the maps, the place names, kind of the same things over and over. And then it still remains kind of much more unusual, more of an anomaly to delve into more of the cultural side of things as your primary focus. And having like new takes on like fantasy races, for example, or fantasy cultures. And of course, I'm sure that the popularity of Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games has also helped to keep that focus on maps. But as I was thinking about this, I also started thinking how even in role-playing games, I played some Dungeons and Dragons and I always tended to get bored. I always thought it was going to be more about character and culture more than it was. And then every game I played, and so much of this does depend on your dungeon master and the other players, I realized like there's a lot of different types of Dungeons and Dragons games. But all the games I've ever played, they just were very focused on like the map and dealing with the terrain and the enemies. That's kind of how the game, I think, is structured at its core, as being the things you're most going to deal with. Also, probably the easiest for a group because it is more about like stats and things than having to like develop cultural tensions. So it might be unrealistic to ever focus mainly on cultures and role-playing games, but I will say that if you are a Dungeons and Dragons or other role-playing game master, dungeon master, and you want to move next door to me and invite me to play your game and you focus more on the cultural stuff, that would be swell. So yeah, my point with this is not to say that you shouldn't think about maps. You shouldn't indulge your love of maps or whatever it is that strikes your fancy about world building, but simply that I would love to see fantasy as a whole stretch in a bigger way beyond the things that Tolkien focused on and start from different origin points. And of course, ElfQuest eventually did have a map, and Tolkien was not completely free from having cultural aspects in his books. Like, you're going to probably dabble a little bit in everything. But I would just love to see more books with deep world building and extensive worlds that really focus on these cultural aspects. And if you have a fantasy that is a favorite of yours that focuses more on culture or any other thing for that matter that is not like as common to focus on. Like, another thing I would love to see more of is like delving into religion in like a real way and not just a like, we worship the high priest, the high dark priest, and we worship the mother goddess, you know. Like, I had a lot of fun playing with a more involved religion that really informs the characters' lives with my Vendiri people. So there's a lot of different aspects that I would love more fantasy writers to tackle than already have. I mean, for everything that I would like to see, somebody's done it. Like 10 people at least have done it, I'm sure. But I would just love to see the whole thing blow open, get more creative, more weird. For that matter, I would also love to see, like, I have a lot of pop cultural world building in the potion dealers, and I would love to see more of that kind of thing. Like, I loved Star versus the Forces of Evil, which is a show that I think has great world building, but it's very goofy. It's goofy, but it's great. And it kind of like plays with pop culture a lot. But it also has some deeper themes and is like very well thought out and realized. I have the Star versus the Forces of Evil magic book of spells, and like, you know, this is a not insignificant world building document. It goes through the history of like all the different generations of royalty in the star butterfly family. I can't remember what the family name is. I think they're the butterfly queen of Muni. That's what I'm looking for. The different queens of Muni. But it manages to be very deep while also being very goofy, which I really appreciate as well. And would love to see more of that too. So basically, like, get weird. Don't be afraid to prioritize different things, and don't feel guilty if you don't have a map, if you don't really need a map yet. If you're new here, my name is Lydia Foxglove, and I am a fantasy author. On this channel, I talk about the creative life in general and the writing life in particular. So if any of that sounds good to you, make sure to click the subscribe and the like if you like this video. If you like more from me, I have a Patreon, Substack, and YouTube memberships, and membership to any of those gets you access to 2 bonus videos a month voted on by you guys, and access to my Discord server where we talk about writing, art, and other nerdy stuff all day. If you'd like to read any of my books, the link is in the description. It helps support the channel, and my personal favorites, the ones I recommend first because they have my deep world building, are my Hidden Lands books. But my free book of the month is Take Me Slowly. It is a very steamy, quite dark vampire romance trilogy, so be warned, you need to like dark as in the romance is dark and the tone is dark. It gets lighter as it goes actually, but it starts out like, I did a lot of very real research on cults just to give you an idea. It's a very uncomfortably realistic cult. And if you'd like to catch my lives, I post every Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for supporting this channel, and I'll see you next time. Bye!